We are live. It is Freedom Day here in Kenya, or Independent Day. So, going to be a whole lot of celebrating going on today across the nation. So, seems fitting that we talk about lifestyle and freedom, individual freedom, for our clients that relocate here. All right. So, let's go ahead and get on into it. For us, we've always been focused on, freedom. It's in the name of the company, right? Uh, it's one of the driving forces and the motivators that, allowed me to start the company. And I think the whole thing was the invisible hand of white supremacy and the invisible hand of the nonsense that we used to deal with as a community and as a family in the United States. And so freedom became a driver. And so that's why, the company is called Diaspora Freedom Initiative. And initially, there was a lot of freedom made or freedom pushes made within the U.S., right? That's where the company started, still a U.S. company, so on and so forth. So a lot of push initially was made there. A lot of our, oldest clients, you know, we were doing grant writing for them, and we were doing government contracting, requests for proposals RFPs and all of that stuff for them. And we were doing formation structuring, how to create, you know, business structures, regardless of which business structure it was, and all of that type of stuff. So that was where we had originally started, and the idea was, okay, we're going to create freedom through, business opportunity, freedom through being in charge of your own time, freedom through turning your job into something that you owned instead of something that you were enslaved to, right? So that was the original freedom that we were focused on. And we did that for years, right? So a lot of whatever job that you're doing in the U.S. anyway, there was typically a government contract for that same thing, right? So it didn't matter what you were doing. We've had clients that worked in food service, like McDonald's, Burger King, that type of thing, Wendy's, and then ended up doing food service contracts for the government, right? So whatever that is that they were doing, that they had some expertise in, they were able to convert that to a government contract, right? We've had people that finance their relocation, to Kenya that way, but in the early days, we weren't connected to Kenya at all. And so, I remember quite vividly somebody who was like a McDonald's, not McDonald's, Wendy's manager. And they were Wendy's manager for years, whatever. They literally mother's basement. I remember being like, wait, what? And so we had onboarded them into the government contracting program. And then they got the government contract for, I want to say it was like Space Camp or something. But they ended up providing food for this, federal government contract, and grew from there. So they turned their job, menial as it may have been looked at, into a government contracting situation. I remember there was a lady from Huntsville, Alabama, and she was an HR professional. This is years ago. It's funny too, because recently another lady from Huntsville, Alabama, who's also an HR professional, onboarded. But years and years ago, Huntsville, Alabama, she worked for a college called Oakwood University. She was an HR professional, and she ended up doing a government contract with a company called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, right? Look that up if you never heard of it. Millennium Challenge Corporation is a company that is 100% owned by Congress, right? But so when they hire their positions, though those hirings end up being government contracts because it's technically considered a government agency since Congress owns it, right? So I remember, we wrote her, her proposal and, used her resume and all of that. And so she got that job where she was an HR manager or whatever for Millennium Challenge Corporation. Instantaneous, like $138,000 a year, right? So whatever your job costs is typically what you get paid when you make that conversion. So that was one of the ways that we were trying to bring freedom to the community in the early days, right? And so what I mean, like they're paying like your health insurance, they're paying you the paid holidays, the time and a half, the all that. When you add all of that up, right? You might think that you're only making $20 an hour, but it might cost $50 an hour, you know, to maintain you as an employee. So what ends up happening with those guys was they would get into that government contract, they would get all $50 an hour, right? Essentially. And so that was where we started. It didn't have the impact that we wanted it to have. And so we started asking the question, why? Why are we creating more businesses in the community than ever? We're structuring them properly. We're creating proper S corps if that's what it needs to be, C corps if that's what it needs to be, LLCs if that's what it needs to be, public benefit corporations if that's what it needs to be, nonprofits if that's what it needs to be, whatever. We're developing extraordinary business plans. We're doing our RFPs. We're doing all of those things to give some freedom to our people, and it's not having the impact that we thought it would. So why? And so as we looked into that, we saw two stats that stood out to us. People from our community owned 1.83% at the time. That number might have changed by now, but 1.83% of the real estate, so corporate real estate, in the entire country. So less than 2%. And less than 1% of all the businesses in our community had anything to do with production and manufacturing, right? So those were the two stats that kept sticking out to us. And then those of you guys who've been following me long enough know about Miss May. Miss May was an older woman in Detroit. She was an older woman at the time. God rest her soul, she's gone now. But she was an older woman at the time, and her granddaughter ended up being, taken by the police, taken away permanently, right? I'm also live on TikTok. You other lives, I could just say what I want to say, but TikTok will shut you down if you say the wrong thing. So they took her away permanently. Chief of police back then, this was before like what we got going on now, right? So chief of police back then was, immediately bad. This was a bad, shoot. This guy needs to go. Like we're done with him. The union was like, no. He pays his union dues, so we have to defend him, right? He's a member of the union. Fair enough. So what Ms. May found out was she owned a shop that did corporate awards. So it did like Employee of the Month, the T-shirt when you go to the amusement park with your company, and you get the T-shirt that says what company you're from and all of that, jazz. She sold that stuff. So here's the police union defending the murderer of her granddaughter vigorously, and then it turns out that the number one supplier of the T-shirts and that she used to, and I guess all apparel that she used to sell as corporate apparel, was the number one donor for that police union. So she was the first individual where it clicked. I say I have a black-owned business, I advertise I have a black-owned business, but the truth is I have a black-owned storefront that before I can even make a dollar in this business, I have to pay people who do not have my best interests at heart, right? And so she was the first one who figured out like, oh, I need to create supply chain in Africa and have a real black-owned business where every part of the supply chain is black-owned and every dollar I spend enriches a black community, right? And so that was her take on it, and she was the first one that set that up overseas, and so that became the focus. The focus became like, okay, yeah, that's the answer. We don't own enough of the supply chain, or at least enough of the supply chain that we use, We don't own enough of the beauty supply chain. We don't own enough of the apparel supply chain. Just the stuff that we utilize. Typically, there's some vertical integration there, and we don't have very much of it. So that became the push and the focus. And then we still weren't having the impact, and the answer to that question the second time we asked it was simply engagement, was simply community engagement. There was nothing on our end that could have been increased that would have created more impact. Now the keys to the kingdom were dangling in front of the community's face, and it was up to them, to grab them. So it was that whole, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And so as we looked, for all of these answers as to how we could provide freedom to the community, those answers started to resonate with a lot of us personally. And it was like, well, look, if the community's not gonna bite, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, be providing freedom for ourselves and our families and all of that. Um, and so that's where the immigration firm and the relocation firm was kind of born. And at first, it was just a division, and it grew to being the bulk of the bulk of the company. And so today, on Kenya's Freedom Day, it makes sense that we would be talking about the ways in which we've gained personal freedom, the ways in which our clients have gained freedom, the ways in which we wish our community would gain freedom, and move forward from there. So that's the type of time I'm on today. If you guys got any questions, if you want to have a conversation on the TikTok side, you can come up. I don't think you can come up on any of these other apps. And that's what we're going to be getting into. So for me, over the years, I think the number one restriction has kind of been movement, and I think it's a restriction that we don't acknowledge very often. Um, but in the United States, your movement is restricted by proxy. There's no sign or law or anything like that that says you're not allowed to move around. But let those red and blue lights start flashing behind your car, and the anxiety and the angst that you immediately feel will let you know that your movement is restricted in that society, right? Um, so for me, the number one freedom that I always wanted was the freedom to move without worrying about not coming home, or worrying about somebody doing something crazy to me for literally no reason at all, right? So movement freedom, I think it's big in the sense that subconsciously, if you can't move freely, how can you grow freely, right? Um, and I think some of that boils down to I was involved in martial arts very, 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 very early. Like I went to my first martial arts class at like the age of 7, and so I got fairly deep into the martial arts and was able to train in different places around the world. So I was able to like go to Wudang Temple in China and train in Shaolin in Zhangjian and stuff like that, right? And so I was exposed to philosophies like Taoist philosophy, um, that had schools of thought in it. One of the schools of thought is feng shui. And in the United States, feng shui is a little more than interior decorating, right? Move this in the corner and hang up this wind chime and da 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 da, right? But that's not real feng shui. Real feng shui is actually like the ancient art of subconscious psychology. That's essentially that. Not even essentially. That's exactly what it is, right? So it was interesting that I was able to kind of train in feng shui young, because it allowed me to see things that affect the psychology that a lot of folks, weren't concerned with, right? And so I see that there's a question on that side. I'm gonna answer that question in a minute. And so what ended up happening was, I'll give you an example. There was like a case study that the feng shui master was showing us, and these folks had this great grand house, right? You think about the house with the circular driveway and it's a big, beautiful mansion and the blah, 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 blah. And stuff wasn't going right in the owner of the house's life, and they eventually called in this feng shui master. And in that circular driveway was this great oak, right? So there's this great oak in the center of the grass circle, in the center of the circular driveway, where the stairs lead up to the big, beautiful house, right? So I'm sure you can picture that, right? You can see it in your head. So I thought the house was like outstanding. Like, geez, these guys are making it. What do they mean? Like, life isn't great. You know what I mean? And they just kept having these setbacks, business setbacks, life setbacks. And, you know, they were connected to the culture. So they called in a feng shui master. And so the feng shui, the initial feng shui was when you open the front door of the house, everything is blocked by the great oak. So the feng shui master relocated the great oak to the back of the house. And the psychology was that when they opened the front door, there was no impediments. And it rolled over into everything, into business, into life, into everything. So they opened the front door. There was no impediments in their life. There was no impediments, to finances. There were no impediments to business deals. Everything was, wide open. And as far as the eye could see, they owned everything, right? It was a different psychology than you open the door and there's this giant immovable object and you have to go around it. You don't have a choice. There's nothing you can do about it. You have to go around that object first thing in the morning as soon as you open the door. Not something that I would have thought about had I not gone through feng shui training. So now all of a sudden you got this giant immovable object in the backyard, right? So you got this solid thing at your back. Nobody can get directly through you. Nobody can directly stab you in the back. They got to go around this solid thing. It gives you more time. And just that mindset shift, that subconscious shift of I have this strong, giant support behind me instead of in front of me, literally changed the way he operated in everything. And that took care of everything. Now, they mystify that kind of stuff and, act like it's like a magic trick or whatever. But I recommend for anybody with time that you actually look into what real, feng shui is about, and how it works, right? So this idea, going back to, how we lived in the US, this idea that anytime I leave my house, like if you were in the Philly area or the New York area, police could just stop you and frisk. It was called stop and frisk. It was literally called stop and frisk, right? So they could just stop you, slam you up against the wall and run your pockets. You know what I mean? Where are you going? Where are you coming from? You look like a criminal. And just for nothing. Literally, you're just walking down the street to a store, right? And they can just stop and frisk. So Google that if you've never heard of it. If you were driving and they could pull up behind you, just hold you there. And then it used to be, now it's considered unconstitutional. But even though it's considered unconstitutional, they still do it. They could just, hold you, pull you over for nothing, and then hold you there for an hour until a canine came, have the canine sniff the car. From our perspective, they could make a move and the dog would recognize that move and pretend it found something, so now they're searching your car. So you're there for 3 hours, right? You were supposed to be at work 3 hours ago. They're searching your whole car. They come up with nothing, or worse yet, they plant something, so that's what the hood is like. Most people in the hood are actually law-abiding citizens, because if they weren't, right, then the hood would be someplace that even the police don't go. Like real hoods where most people are not law-abiding citizens, those are the no-go zones. There are places like that in LA where police do not respond to calls, right? Because you can't win. There's way more citizens than there's ever been police. So in the places that are actually patrolled, most people are law-abiding. That's why you're able to patrol them, right? And so you end up with just a bunch of law-abiding people who are being harassed in their own community. So that was the truth. That was my, experience, and the truth, to living in Philly, and the truth of living in, places in New York City, and places in New Jersey. Right across the bridge from Philly is Camden, New Jersey, and all of that. So for us who lived in those places, that was the reality of it. So finding freedom became a solid motivating force. All right. Amin Sadat Black, is Kenya really a better country than the United States? For some people, maybe. You know what I mean? I was just describing black experience in those particular black communities that I personally have experience in, right? I don't know what the black experience is like in Detroit. I don't know what the black experience is like in St. Paul, Minnesota, right? But the black experience for me, being born in America and coming up in those cities, um, Kenya's way better, 100%. So for some people, maybe, maybe depending on what community you're in, it's not. So that's my answer to that. Is it better financially? Like that's a bit of a anecdotal answer from my own anecdotal experiences. But are there any ways in which it's objectively better? Yeah, its bond market is objectively better than the U.S. bond market, right? So I can invest in sovereign debt, right? So I can invest in sovereign debt and make equity level returns here. I can't do that in the United States. I can host what's the buzzword for it? Group economics is the buzzword for it. Real group economics, the way that other ethnicities and other groups of people in the United States operate group economics, is called syndication. That is the legal term for group economics. In America, you cannot be involved in syndication unless you are a qualified investor, right? There are caveats, but not enough of them, right? So there are ways, something called a sophisticated investor, but then there's a limited amount of sophisticated investors allowed in the deal, and the blah 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 blah. You also can't advertise real group economics in the United States. It's illegal, right? Again, there are caveats, there are exceptions, but you can't advertise it, right? So you're only allowed. You guys go look this up independently. Do your independent, research. But to Mr. Black's question, you're only allowed to be part of a syndication if you had a prior relationship with the syndicators, because you're not allowed to advertise. Beyond not being allowed to advertise, you have to be a qualified investor. In order to be a qualified investor, you have to have $1 million net worth, not including your primary residence. And you have to have made the number of changes depending on whether you're married or not, but you have to have made like $200,000 a year for the last 2 years, the 2 years preceding the event and the year of the investment, right? I don't know what the current stats are, but I know the stats, last time I looked them up, it was like 16% of white people and 1% of black people, right? Actually qualified. And some of these investments are like, it's like nothing. Like I'm trying to remember, I think it was Uber. There's a guy who invested in Uber. He invested, it was a qualified investment, so you had to be a qualified investor. He invested $5,000. And the $5,000 went all the way to like him being a millionaire, right? But that's it. But you had to be a qualified investor by SEC rules to make that investment. So you're telling me that like the RN that lives in the hood, but she's making 70,000 a year, she's still a traveling nurse or a traveling RN, even though she's in the hood, that person couldn't have sacrificed $5,000 to make $1 million 15 years later for her family because she wasn't a qualified investor? What kind of protective mechanism is that, right? Which is what they sell it as. Yet, plenty of other countries around the world don't have that mechanism, and their people aren't being ripped off left and right. So what is it really? Right? It's institutional racism at its best. The foundation of the United States of America has always been, and looks like will always be, institutional racism. So that's what these rules are, right? So you cannot be part of group economics in the United States unless you're already a millionaire, not real group economics. And a lot of the stuff that people are like, oh, we're putting this thing together, in our community, it's actually illegal. It's actually considered a security by the SEC. You're actually supposed to be a qualified investor to get involved in it. You're not a qualified investor. And so they can be shut down just like that. Right? And so from that perspective, objectively, there's more opportunity and it's better. But it's not, that's not even something that's Kenyan only. But so anecdotally, I would say yes for me. And then objectively, I would say yes under those categories. Does that answer your question? Well, it's a generational thing as well, right? I've always been focused on the next generation. And so, I was able to grow up outside of Philadelphia, right? And so I was able to kind of do that in a smaller city, but with just as much nonsense. It was still a city. So I was born in the projects. By the time we were 4, I made it out of the projects into the hood. Worst part of the city, period. The city was divided into wards, which I guess maybe kind of like boroughs, but or like precincts actually. So it was divided into wards. I lived in the 6th ward once we got away from the project housing. The 6th ward was literally the worst ward. Most all of that, right? So left the projects into the hood. The hood is typically worse than the projects because in the projects, what ends up happening is if you break the law at all, you're typically kicked out of project housing. And project housing is almost like Section 8. It's typically relatively cheap, right? So you don't want to lose that. And that means you're not selling drugs out of the project, and all that stuff, right? And, where we were from. Now, in other states with different state laws, whatever. But where we were from, the projects were actually a bit cleaner than the hood because you would lose your housing for any infraction, right? So we actually left a safer environment in the projects and moved to the hood for the dream of home ownership. And then I was there until I was grown, right? Now the hood changed, right? So the hood improved by the time I was grown. It wasn't the worst. That moved to the south side with the influx of a new minority group, right? But when I was growing up, it was it's about 50% black, right? By the time I was 18, it was 75% Hispanic, and they were concentrated on one side of the city, and then that became the bad. Before black people were there, it was the Polacks, and they were the bad group, and that's where everything was concentrated, right? So the truth of the matter is that unreported crime is not part of crime statistics. So wherever the police are not looking is going to have a lower crime rate, right? So with all of these minority groups, that have their time, the police would focus on that group, and so they would have the highest crime rate, right? You follow somebody for 10 minutes, and they're gonna break a law, right? Or an ordinance or something. They're gonna roll through a stop sign, or they're gonna turn left without indicating. They're gonna do something stupid that you can pull them over for if you just follow them for 10 minutes. Right. And if you record all of that, now all of that's part of the crime statistics. So now all of a sudden their crime stats are through the roof and they're the worst element in your town. And it's just more, white supremacy bullshit. So that's the way most cities work. And so we were able, though, because of the Appalachian Trail, we were able to kind of leave the city and go out into the woods and kind of get a bit of a natural education, and interact with the world in the way that kids should be able to and people should be able to by removing ourselves from the city, right? So I was able to like go play in the woods essentially, like a country boy, even though we were from the city. And so that helped me figure out what was possible, right? I saw more than just the cops stopping frisking everybody, and you know people being lost to drive-bys and stuff like that every day. That stuff was happening, but I also had this additional exposure big up to my mom and dad, of going out into the woods and going, camping and, exploring creek beds and stuff like that, that a lot of, city kids may not have had. So I knew which kind of upbringing was better, right? Now, my elementary school class, which my elementary school was K through fifth grade. And so the people who were with me, K through five, of the boys in that class, there's only three of us alive, that are not in prison, right? So they're either in prison or they're in the ground. There's only three of us who aren't, right? Honor Roman, Marquise Cortez, and myself. Everybody else in prison or in the ground, right? From that elementary school class. So that's crazy. And it wasn't private school, right? We not only were there too many people in the class, they doubled down on that and they did grade splits. So when we went to elementary school, it was a first second split. So first grade and second grade were in the same classroom, right? Third grade and fourth grade were in the same classroom. The only kids that weren't were the fifth graders. They got their own thing. That's where the split stopped, right? So not only were there too many kids to teachers, they doubled it. So instead of it being 30 kids and one teacher, it was 60 kids and one teacher, right? So madness. Um, Thinking back, so crazy. But anyway, utter madness, right? So you were talking about, of 60 kids, maybe about 30 of them being boys. There's three boys that are not in prison or in the ground from that elementary class. It's crazy. So that that was the culture, man. And so coming out here and knowing that, like, my son can roam freely. He can go play on the beach all day and come back before the street lights come on, and he's fine. Um, the violent crime rate here is less than 1%. Most people have never seen a fight in their life, right? Um, that kind of environment and that kind of community, to be able to raise children in, to me, was part of freedom, right? So that's another big part of why, I relocated out here. So, you know, um, that's not for everybody. Not everybody's family oriented. Not everybody cares about that. Some people even glorify the worst parts of the culture. They want gang affiliation and they want, those experiences. And okay, more power to them. But for me, I needed to be free of all the BS. So, and that's super important to me. And my clients mirror a lot of that, right? Typically, your target client, if you're a founder, is very similar to you. And so a lot of my clients mirror that need for freedom, that need for financial freedom, that need for location freedom, even travel freedom. That's why we have so many passport portfolio clients, right? The ability to just move when you want to move, even if there's a restriction against maybe your primary country or something, like that. The ability to just move when you want to move, is a freedom that folks like me want and go after. So freedom. It's all about freedom today in Kenya's Freedom Day, Jamhuri Day, the day of the Republic, the day the Republic was established, right? And the day that Kenya gained its independence. Why do I keep swatting at? There's like a bee bothering me. I guess you can't see it on the camera. I don't know why this bee is all up in my face, but yeah, that's what I'm swatting at. Oh yeah, I mean, we've been talking about the So that's, it's funny you asked that. Before I guess directly go at it, it's funny you asked that because I guess we feel like because we're part of the richest country in the world, and I'm just assuming you're also American, that financial freedom exists in our country, right? So we tend to kind of fall into like, oh well, the financial freedom those in the United States, the opportunity is in the United States. Da, 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 da. That's not true for me. That hasn't been true for the people of my community that I'm aware of. Right now, maybe in other communities that's incredibly true. I don't know. Not going to speak on experiences that I haven't had, right? But that is definitely not true in my community. And so, interestingly, I've had way more financial freedom here and the ability to make way better financial moves in Kenya than I ever had in America. In fact, some of the financial moves that, if I were to duplicate them in America, would be illegal, not because there's some kind of like law or somebody is harmed, but because I'm not what the SEC um, uh, says is a qualified investor, right? Again, you really got to look that up. You really got to look that up. What a qualified investor is and what qualified investors are allowed to do versus, what people who are not qualified investors are not allowed to do. You definitely got to look that up and get into that. Because that's the only thing that would make some of those things illegal. Some of the investments and stuff that I've made are only illegal in the United States because I'm not a millionaire. Crazy. If I'm a millionaire, it's legal. If I'm not a millionaire, illegal. And if I'm a millionaire but I haven't had my money long enough, still illegal. Because to be a qualified investor, you have to have $1 million net worth, not including your primary residence. So if you inherit a house that's now worth $1 million, that doesn't count, right? And you had to make a certain amount of money that only a very small percentage of Americans make annually for the last 3 years. So I could literally win the Powerball today and next year still not be a qualified investor. While sitting on $60 million, wanting to make a $10,000 investment that requires a qualified investor to make. I got $60 million in cash from hitting the Powerball. Illegal for me to make the $10,000 investment because I'm not a qualified investor. Right? So it's not even about money. It's literally about access to the game. Right? And those qualified investments are the ones that make the highest return. Right? Hey, Antoine, Kenya is a gold mine. So many opportunities. Absolutely. There's a fund, you guys, again, Google. There's a fund called Oak Special Fund. Look up what the return on investment is on Oak Special Fund. In the United States, you need to be a qualified investor. Here, you can get in the Oak Special Fund and make 20% on your investment. In the United States, you're not a qualified investor. You're lucky you're making 8. And those are the numbers that you'll be quoted. Oh yeah, just, let your money return at, 8 to 10%. You're above inflation, and your money's working for you because you're not a qualified investor. That's the type of stuff that people talk to you about. Here, it's standard that regular citizens are making 20% in the Oak Special Fund. They're making 20% in the Mansa X Special Fund, right? They're making 60% in the Arvco Pro Special Fund. 60% return on investment. You don't need to be a qualified investor. Right? We just did our annual report, and on average, our bond laddering clients are making 13.46% in aggregate. All the 6 different bonds that have been combined, right? 13% in sovereign debt, right? So with the lowest amount of risk possible, 13%. So that's what it's all about. So from the perspective of where is the financial freedom, for us and for people like me, that's definitely here. It's here way more than it's anywhere else. Definitely here. Couldn't do half the things that I do here if I was still in the United States. So there's that. All right, Antoine. Yeah, man, you're doing your thing. I love it. Sounds good, man. Leverage, leverage, leverage. Sounds really good. Yeah, leverage both of those XM banks. Nothing wrong with that. Isn't it interesting though, like how, for the most part, if you were still in the United States, you wouldn't even have access to the XM bank? It's funded by tax dollars. You pay your taxes. But if you were still in the U.S., doing business in the U.S. like that, you wouldn't even have access to that bank. Crazy. So by leaving the U.S., you gained more access to to U.S. government-backed wealth than you would have had if you had stayed in the U.S. Pretty interesting. Yeah, man, we'll be looking forward to hear from you. Right. That's an interesting question. Yeah, but the answer is yes. you know, so okay, there are financial benefits, you know, for being people like me, but what about health benefits? Yeah, there are definitely health benefits. I just had a surgical procedure, laparoscopic, no scar, you know, surgical procedure that would have cost me a few $1,000s minimum in the United States for just the procedure. Then I would have had another few $1,000s for the stay. Then I would have had, you know, medication costs and all of that. And so the entire thing was like a 6 to 8 week thing, right? So you have the procedure, and then they leave like a tube inside of you to help you heal. That takes 6 weeks. Then you basically have another surgery to get the tube out, and then you have like a follow up after that. So it's like an eight week ordeal. Easily would have cost me $30,000 $40,000 in the United States. It didn't cost me a dime here, right? Did not cost me a dime here. So freedom on that side, definitely increased compared to what I experienced in the United States as well. So healthcare freedom for sure, financial freedom for sure, you know, freedom of movement for sure, right? So freedom of investment for sure. Generational wealth freedom, absolutely. All right. So and you know, typically your biggest kind of indicators of freedom are time freedom, right? You have the time to do what you want when you want, right? Financial freedom, of course. That's the one that everybody kind of focuses on. So you don't have to worry about money anymore. Health freedom, right? You don't die early or you're restricted to a wheelchair because of diabetes or, you know, whatever the case is in that, right? So you want to be able to do this thing as long as possible if you're enjoying it, right? And mental freedom, right? You want to be able to learn what you want to learn when you want to learn it, free from any kind of propaganda and nonsense, right? So those are typically your four freedom flexes, right? And you can definitely do all of them here. It just depends on your environment. As to whether you see them as clearly, right? When you're in Nairobi, there's still a lot of hustle and bustle. It's like a New York style town, so you can get caught up in that. but there's also a lot available to you. A lot of people like the convenience of it, right? I'm in a beachside town, what that might be considered like out into the country type of thing, right? And so it's a different lifestyle, but those freedoms are definitely there for you, and then you get to explore what you want. Then you get to explore, the hobbies that you want, the the activities that you want, the finances that you want, and get into that. How do I gain more time? So I mean, obviously, everybody has 24 hours in a day, but there's a couple ways to gain time. Number one is to be in control of your life enough that no one can rush you. So that's number one. Number two is to be in a position where you can hire people to assist you, right? So every person you hire should buy you more time. If you hiring somebody is not buying you time, then you probably shouldn't be hiring them, right? Because there's some such a thing as a vanity hire, right? So if you're hiring somebody, you should be buying back time. If you're not buying back time with that hire, then you should be buying extreme opportunity. So you're either buying somebody who can open a door through a hire, or you're buying back your own time through a hire. Those are the only two things that hiring should be doing, right? In my professional opinion, the more people you hire, the more time you buy back, right? So like in my situation, we stopped dealing with the chef because it wasn't buying us back any time, because we do like to cook and we'll just cook anyway and like whatever, right? So having someone make three meals, and then we're making little intermediate meals and all that stuff, it didn't really buy back enough time. But the maid is a different thing, right? You hire the maid, you buy back the time that you would have been cleaning the house every day, especially if you got a kid, right? There's going to be a whole bunch of cleaning going on in that house. Same thing with the governess, right? There's certain things that you don't need to do as parent, to rear the child, right? There's plenty of things that you do need to do and be engaged in and all the that. There's plenty of things that you don't, right? That's why school and pre-K and daycare and all that stuff, is in existence and works, right? There's things that you don't need to do in the child rearing process that takes time, right? If that wasn't true, then daycare wouldn't exist, right? And so in those situations, you can bring in a nanny. In those situations, you can bring in a governess, depending on what the outcome for that child is, and buy back that time. That's what those things do. When you pay for daycare, you're buying back time. Right now, typically in the United States, you're buying time to go to work. So it might not be an effective trade, but that's what it is. You're buying back time by hiring those folks. So that's how you get time freedom. That's how that works. Right. Yeah. So it's a direct result of financial freedom. Yes. Financial freedom really doesn't mean anything. Finances are a token of value, essentially. So the more value you create for the marketplace, the more finances come to you, and the more finances you have, the more you can pay people for their value. So that's all. That's all that really is. There have been, see, as Americans, we don't remember a time when like currency was reset, for example. Chinese do, right? So there was a time where the Chinese had, and I don't even remember what the old currency was called, but now they have the yuan or the renminbi. There are people who are still alive that remembered when that changed, right? So those people had a million of the old currency, and then the government changed currencies, and then that million became 10,000 of the new currency, right? So there are folks that remember stuff like that. Something similar just happened in Nigeria where they like switched up the currency and stuff like that. So there are people around the world who remember stuff like that. And so when you understand, that that can happen with currency and how currency works and how inflation works and all these other things, then you understand that the currency itself and the finances itself isn't what you think it is, right? It's just a token. It's just a placeholder for value, right? And then depending on which currency you have, indicates, which level of world value you're dealing with. And then you trade that around. But if the government stopped, or even the central bank of a government stopped, the piece of paper would be worthless, right? So it's just a token that the people have agreed upon as a placeholder for value. That's it. And once you understand that, yes, it does get easier. Yeah, that's a good observation. Yeah, once you understand it, it's way easier to make money, because typically the mindset, all right, I need to go get some money. How am I going to get this money? I'm going to go out there and get this money, but I don't know how. How am I going to get it? Right? That ends up being the mindset that creates stress and frustration and whatever. But once you understand what money is, then it's just, how am I going to add value to somebody else? That's it. Right? So it shifts the focus. Instead of like this selfish thing of you trying to go and whatever, you start thinking about how to help people. And the more value you can deliver to the world, the bigger the problem is that you can solve, the more, the more money you're going to make off of that, right? So the focus shifts to, okay, cool, let me solve a problem, right? Oh, I don't, my finances aren't where I want them to be. Let me solve a problem, and they'll be where I want them to be, right? Because all you're doing is focusing on money. It's not going to work out all that well for you. But if you focus on creating value, then money is never going to be a problem. Value invents money. It's actually in the word, right? A new company pops up and it's the big new company on the block. How do we figure out what that company is worth? A valuation. We do a valuation on that company, and then we say, oh, they're worth 100 billion. They haven't done 100 billion in sales. They don't own 100 billion in assets. So where did this 100 billion come from? Right? It didn't exist the day before the valuation. So you have to understand that money is just a token for value. And once you understand that, then making money is not difficult. You're not alone. You're not alone in never having thought of it that way. Most people don't. That's why most people struggle with money. The bigger the problem you solve, the higher the valuation of that solution will be. Well, part of the trick is going to be whether or not the people can even recognize it as a problem, right? Like, would there have been money in solving slavery, right? Did most of the people in that predicament see it as a problem? So even if it legitimately was a problem, right? What are some of the things that are attributed to, like, Harriet Tubman, that she could have saved more people if they knew they were enslaved, right? And that she had to let so many people leave so many people behind because they didn't realize that there was a problem, right? So even though she was the solution, the value attached to it by that market was negligible because they didn't realize that there was a problem. So that's the other half of it. There has to be a problem to everybody, not just a problem to you. Right, or at least everybody you're helping, right? Of course. No, no, that's not, no. So big and important are not synonymous. So it doesn't have to be an important problem at all. It just has to be a big enough problem. Think of the Pet Rock. They did over 1 million units of sale, and it cost more than $1. So they did over $1 million in sales. The Pet Rock was a rock from a lake in Mexico that they polished and painted. Right, that's all it was. Right. So was it an important problem that they were able to solve with the Pet Rock? No, there was just a big enough gap in the market, and the marketing was on point that people thought they needed that thing, and so they maybe even saw a problem that didn't exist, and somebody stepped in and solved that problem that didn't exist, that was big enough to do over 1 million in sales, right? So not important, just big, just big. That's part of the problem, is it's just what people want, not necessarily what they need. If it was what they need, McDonald's would be broke. It's what they want more so than what they need. Yeah, if it was what they need, the Salad Works would have the over 1 million served, and McDonald's would be, you know what I mean? But it's not. It's not what they need. It's what they want. That's the issue with like freedom fighting businesses. That's the issue with like businesses that try to save the black community and like all that stuff. It's not what they need. It's not what the market needs. It's what they want. And half the time, what they want is Jordans instead of generational wealth. So Jordan is a billionaire, and Huey Newton and like the Huey P. Newton Foundation is not, right? So that's the downside of it. When it's a free market, that's the downside of it. What's the alternative? Well, there's plenty of alternatives, right? A closed market is also an alternative. That's what we saw in China, right? I lived in China for quite some time, so I actually got to see it firsthand. But in China, they would close their market, right? They had a market economy, but not a free market economy. So they would close their market, and so like Google wasn't allowed in, and so they ended up forcing their people to create their own Google, which is arguably better for their experience and based on culture than Google is, right? So they allowed a local person to become the Google there, right? They blocked out, what else is blocked out? Facebook is blocked out. So they have their own Facebook, right? Their Facebook is called WeSing or WeChat, right? They have their own Instagram. It's called QQ. They have their own Google. It's called Baidu, right? So what they did was they literally blocked. It's called the Great Firewall of China. Actually, they literally blocked the IP addresses of all of those companies that dominated, essentially the world, and they gave their own people the opportunity to make their version of those things. And so that's a closed market. That's not a free market. It's not an open market, right? But that closed market allowed them to look at what was working elsewhere and then let people in their sandbox create, an equivalency. And every time there was a problem within the sandbox where they weren't doing well enough, then they would let one of the other people in, right? And let that whale come in and stir things up. And so they did that with Tesla, right? They allowed Tesla to come into the market, and shake things up with their electric vehicle manufacturers, and then their electric vehicles manufacturers stepped up to beat Tesla, which they did, in my opinion. I was just there a month ago, and Teslas are like the most limited EVs in the country, and the country's full of EVs. And you can tell because they've actually created a system where electronic vehicles have a different license plate, so you can just look at the car and know that it's an EV. And so that's a solution. That's one solution. It's not necessarily the solution, and it's not necessarily that there is a the solution, right? But that's a solution, right? But it requires discipline that has never existed for people to do it, right? The government enforced that, and that works because now the government is enforcing that discipline. You can't go to Google, you can't go to Facebook, you can't, go to these things and do anything. If you want to do something, figure it out, but you can't do that. Okay, all right, that's government imposed. So the issue then becomes that on an individualistic level, folks tend to go to the path of least resistance. So we can't necessarily, well, we can, it's just never happened in human history since history has been recorded. um, as a community, say, all right, well, we're not using Google anymore, we're not using TikTok anymore, or we're not using YouTube anymore, or Facebook anymore, and we're going to do our own thing, right? We go live on Fanbase all the time, which is a black-owned social media network, right? But it is definitely not the same thing as going live on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or anything else, right? So we don't have the discipline as a community to do, and nobody does. It's not a knock. Nobody does. It's been successful in China because the government forced it. You know what I mean? So that's a solution, but then you have to be surrounded by a government that actually cares about you as its people, moving forward with some kind of inheritance for the next generation, which is what you have over there. They all but eliminated poverty, which is crazy, right? They brought like 70% of their poor population into the middle class in the last 10 years. It's nuts. Home ownership is like at 80% or something crazy like that. Very similar to Singapore. I think Singapore is a bit stronger because they actually had less freedom, right? Like in Singapore, they actually forced integration. So whatever percentage of minorities there were in the population, that percentage had to be representative in like housing, right? So Singapore provided housing for all its citizens, but if 10% of the citizens were, Africans, then 10% of the housing has to be Africans. If 15% of the citizens were, Greeks, 15% of the housing had to be Greek. So they actually enforced kind of a rainbow coalition, which obviously worked out very, very well for them. So it's a matter of the sacrifices that are willing to be made, to establish a baseline and create a future for the people that you're responsible for, essentially. And not every government's willing to do that, and not no community has been disciplined enough to do it without government, oversight and interjection. And most of those governments were fought along the way, right? Like now, you're not going to go to China and have anybody, fighting against, what China has done because it's benefited everyone, right? Same thing with Singapore. Singapore is Singapore, and like a lot of African countries got their independence at the exact same time. Singapore has left them dust, right? But there were protests and there were, skirmishes between, government officials, and Tiananmen Square and all of that kind of stuff happened on the path to this level of like sovereignty. And so so people are going to fight you doing the right thing on the way to benefiting you. Like people will fight against their own best interests, and that's, par for the course. It's what we've seen the most of recently in the United States. Just people just fighting against their own best interests for what, who knows. But that's what happens. The freer society gets, it's almost like the higher their risk tolerance gets. And then they want to start doing things that risk their entire republic or their society as a whole. So it's interesting. Thanks, Ahmed. I'm happy that you enjoy them. To me specifically, yeah, you can always schedule a consultation. On an initial consultation, I always pop in, or I always host it myself. So if you want to speak to me specifically, you can always do that. If you want to speak to like uh, one of our lawyers or something, just schedule a law consultation. One of our lawyers will pop in there. There's not much breeze today, actually. Now that you mentioned that, but it is a good day. Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, definitely, definitely do that. Yeah, there's also something called the what is it called? The American Center in the embassy. They can give you some business advice on that as well. So definitely reach out to those banks, but also check out the American Center. Contact numbers in the bio. Yeah, the corporate numbers in the bio. Uh, I'm a USMC. Oh, Marine Corps veteran. Okay. Yes, 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 yes. You can use your service connection, like your VA hospital stuff. You can use that here. We have. There's another. We don't have actually. We're not affiliated like that. But there's another company out here that's super legit. That we recommend, to folks. They focus on medical tourism, and the founders of that, and they also do the VA like service connected thing. So on the medical side, if you're VA service connected, you're trying to come out here and make sure that you'll be able to do VA service connected things. Yeah, that's definitely available. Their organization is called Traverse Culture, and they focus on medical tourism. We don't focus on medical tourism, but they do, and they process a lot of like VA health claims. So if you need like their number or something, just send a direct message on what platform are you on? I think that's YouTube. Send a direct message and ask, about medical tourism or whatever, and we'll definitely put you in touch with them. Aren't they a competitor? No, no one's really a competitor. They do the same thing that we do to a certain extent. There are some things that we do that they don't do, and things that they do that we don't do. But our clients are always going to be our clients, and their clients are always going to be their clients. So that's not really how competition works. So yeah, we don't have to like dislike them because we're in the same industry. They're legitimate. They're legitimate service providers. They do good work. They don't rip people off. They're legit. As far as the service providers that are American go, well, especially like Black Americans go, it's only us and them. We're the only two legit ones. But you know, we wouldn't down talk them or not refer people to them just because it seems like we have the same client, because we don't. Our clients are different than their clients, and our clients will never be their clients, and their clients will never be our clients. Right? There's crossover, right? So we do estate planning. Our estate planning clients might be their relocation clients, and our relocation clients might be their medical tourism clients, but we would never share the same client in the same tranche. It just doesn't work that way, right? McDonald's clients are not Wendy's clients. Wendy's clients are not Arby's clients. Like, they're not actually competing against each other. And if you get too stuck in that mindset, then you start losing your own clients, because then you're playing someone else's game, right? Run your business the way you're going to run your business, and the people that resonate with that will come to it. And I'll tell you what, if you're attracting people who don't resonate with it, you're going to have a really, really shitty entrepreneurial experience. It's going to be tough for you because those are not your people. They're going to irk your damn nerves, right? We when we stopped just taking any old client and we started being particular about our target client, even our employee retention increased by like double digits, like 70%, because the employees were just annoyed by the people who really didn't jive with us that we would take on. And it would get to the point where even they would quit from dealing with these ridiculous people. And so once we locked in on, dealing with only our target clients, everybody's life was a hell of a lot better. I'm on every day at this time, Renee. I'm live every day at this time. Today's a national holiday. I'm live. I was live the day after my dad died, so I'm live every day at this time. No, so you're right. Like I'm not gonna argue with you about it, right? Like if you think that, you're gonna lose clients, you're right. If you think you're not gonna lose clients, you're right. It's just the way that you see the world. So if you think that that's gonna affect your business, you're right. It will, because you'll make it affect your business. It's called self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think that that's going to affect you, it will. If you think it won't affect you, it won't. So you're correct. Sure, sure, sure. Um, Typically, I mean, so the base is a matter of safety. Um, Typically, risk tolerance is not very high in my community, right? So typically, black folks in general or are privately conservative, right? They're conservative in their own homes and all that. I'm not talking about Republicans and Democrats. I mean, what we do in our houses, we're typically conservative, and we typically don't have a very high risk tolerance. So bond laddering is essentially an answer to risk tolerance. So that's why we, kind of focus on that. Folks who have a better risk tolerance, they tend to go off into other things, money market funds, IFTs, stuff like that, where there's, an increased chance for higher returns, but there's also an increased risk to lose all your money, right? So that just depends on whatever your risk tolerance is. Sovereign debt is pretty safe. And if you're dealing with a place that has sovereign debt that's trading at equity levels above and beyond the S&P 500, then that's a bonus, right? So that's typically what bond ladderers are getting out of. They're getting a very, very safe play, and then they get, about 20 years of passive income, where they don't have to worry about working, and that check just keeps coming in. So that's where the bond laddering thing comes up. Somebody asks every day. Like, it's one of the most, looked at parts of our business is the bond laddering. Most of our clients bond ladder when they come in. It's an upgrade that most of our clients typically deal with. And on every live, no matter what the topic of the live is, somebody asks about bond ladder. So you're not being inquisitive on that. It's very interesting. Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. I 100% get it. It's the only thing. Like, people always ask, like, oh, what would your younger self? Da, 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 da. It's the only answer I have, right? Like, I would have bond laddered way earlier in life, and probably done it in some sort of generational wealth trust type of situation, and I'd be a billionaire. right? Like, like if I would have done that at 18 and set it up in like a trust situation, and just to now, from 18 to now, so like 25 years, I absolutely be a billionaire off of that. And so there's a guy in China who did that. There's a guy in China who's part of a robotics company, and he writes the code. And so he's one of those folks that became people don't talk about him because the what is it, the buzz, phrasing on billionaires is, oh, you can't become a billionaire unless you took advantage of people. Da, 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 da. He literally built robots, let the robots do the work, has no employees, took advantage of nobody, and became a billionaire, right? So he's never had an employee a day in his life. He built the robots himself. He did the work himself, right? Put the robots out there, made his billion that way, right? So like, yeah, especially your anti-capitalists and all that don't like to talk about it because they like to live under this pretense that the only way to make money is to take advantage of other people, or to take advantage of their labor, or to take advantage of whatever. And so there's millionaires and a few billionaires that have never, taken advantage of anyone else's labor but their own, and typically make their money off of compounding. And so if you were compounding and bond laddering early in life, you could definitely reach a billionaire level without ever engaging anyone, right? You could just let money grow for you at that level, and not have any employees, not have anything, right? So hindsight being 2020, it's like the only thing that I would ever, you know, answer that question as far as what would you tell your younger self? Like, yeah, go freaking start laddering bonds. That's what I would tell you. I'm working, but I took a break to thank you for those. No problem, man. No problem at all. I don't know, man. I swear that comes from just experience. You know what I mean? So maybe not. Maybe not. Because if your journey is that your family, has already established something. I worry about that with my descendants, actually. But if your journey is that their family established something, and through way of that establishment has sent you to law school, and by way, of that opportunity, you are now a lawyer. Which a lot of my lawyers, that's kind of their story, right? So now you know the law, but you've never been homeless yourself. Like, you've never been on the street yourself. You've never been stop and frisked yourself. You've never had, your best friend get mistakenly identified as someone else, and unalived in a drive-by, pew pewing, right? And so if you haven't been through those things, are you going to be as insightful? I don't know. So most of my legal team they have no idea what any of that is like, right? Because they're all Kenyan. I don't have American lawyers on the team. So they're all Kenyan lawyers. And so there's no concept of that, in their world. So I don't know if they're as insightful as me, but they're definitely knowledgeable in the law. Like, they know, what their levels, their expertises are, and their levels of expertise are. But as far as like real world knowledge, I don't know if that if that would be the case. Ain't nothing wrong with that. Air hustle away, bro. Yeah, man. Oh yeah, 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 definitely. Kansas City, yeah. OKC, I've heard. I haven't been out there experiencing myself, but I heard. Philly, yeah, yeah. It's a mess. It's a mess. Mm. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, your experiences are definitely going to change your worldview. And then, oddly enough, I don't think it's the experiences per se that have the biggest impact on the worldview. And this is anecdotal, just I guess from my own experience, but I think it's the solutions that do. So the way you solve experiences have the biggest impact on your worldview, in my anecdotal opinion. Yep, 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 yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was a standard thing. Standard thing. I We had folks that had like a bum car and a good car just for that. So like, if you were traveling around town, you drove the bum car around just so that the police wouldn't pull you over. And but if you were traveling, somewhere far, then you'd break out, the Cadillac or the Corvette or whatever it is that you had to do that you know long haul trip. So it's crazy. It's crazy that you would have two cars to make sure that you don't have a police interaction. But there's all kinds of nutty stuff that people who are not from that community have never even heard of. And it's expensive. It's expensive to be poor. It's expensive to live in the hood. Way more expensive than it is to live in rich suburbia, and people don't realize that either. So it's incredibly expensive to be poor in the United States, and incredibly expensive to live in the hood. All right, brother. You're always welcome here. Thanks for stopping by. All right. So on this Freedom Day, Independence Day, any other questions on how to get free? How are you going to get yourself free? What are you going to do? How are you going to get yourself free? It's up to you. If you want to be free, you can be. It's up to you. How are you going to do it? All right. Been here for an hour and a half. If there are any questions, throw a one in the chat and I will wait for your question. Thanks, brother. Happy Jamhuri Day. If there are no questions, then I'll call it for today. Gonna go play tennis today. Any questions? Last call for questions. All right, awesome. Well, enjoy Jamhuri Day. Enjoy your day if you're not here in Kenya and it's not a holiday for you. And I will see you tomorrow at the exact same time. All right, guys, have fun. My heart is in Kenya. I can dig it. What's this now? I'll try coming to another one of your lives. I like your perspective. I like your perspective of Africa repatriation. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose a lot of people refer to it as repatriation. I just call it relocation because it's more accurate from a legal perspective. Or having the lawyers, having the lawyers working on it. But yeah, you know, We make it happen as best we can. If you resonate with our perspective on it, then you might be the kind of client that we like to help. So yeah, stop by. All right, guys. Talk to you guys later.